describe this in more depth, but throughout the training, there will be real-time learning opportunities, ASRs, active student responding. The trainers are going to use these ASRs in real time to help foster learning opportunities for everybody that's a part of the training. But please know that any examples that you put in the pair deck are going to be de-identified. Throughout the training, we ask that you keep your line muted. The trainers may also disable video feed to lessen the demands on bandwidth throughout the training session. And as it relates to breaks during the training, they will probably occur around 10 a.m. and also around 11 a.m. for about 10 minutes each. For everybody that's on the line today, please do not share any protected health or any personally identifiable information for individuals that you provide services to, have provided services to, will provide services to. So any discussions that you have, whether they're in the chat or they're orally with the trainers, need to only contain publicly shareable information. Catherine and Stephanie are going to give a bit more housekeeping information at the beginning of the presentation about the format and how to interact using the pair deck and such. I want to note a couple of things about certificates of attendance and continuing education units. So for everybody that's on the line today, a certificate of attendance can be provided if you would like to have one. The trainers are going to announce to you at different times throughout the training opportunities for you to type in your name and email address. It's probably going to happen 2 or 3 times, and typing that information in will come to me after the training, and I will make sure that you get a training certificate as quickly as possible. Now, additionally, for this training, DBHTS has partnered with WVU to provide continuing education units free of charge for 100 BCBAs, BCBADs, or BCABAs. I want to note 3 very important things about this. 1, the CEs are capped at the first 100 behavior analysts. Second, the CEs are going to be first come, first served based upon completion of a Qualtrics questionnaire that the WVU team is going to provide at the conclusion of the training. Lastly, for this training, as well as for the one on Wednesday, there is not an option to purchase continuing education units for this training. So if you were a behavior analyst and you would like to obtain continuing education units, please go ahead and complete that Qualtrics questionnaire promptly. Let me go ahead now, shift gears and present Catherine and Stephanie. So once again, very pleased to have Catherine and Stephanie here with us for this training series. They're from West Virginia University. That's where they did their studies. And for those that aren't aware, WVU is continuously recognized as having one of the most top-notch premier behavior analysis doctoral programs in the world. So both of our presenters have worked in Dr. Claire St. Peter's Severe Behavior Lab at WVU, and I'm just, once again, super excited to have them provide training to us today, as well as on the next training topic that's going to happen on Wednesday. Catherine Williams is a board-certified behavior analyst who will earn her PhD in psychology with an emphasis in behavior analysis from WVU in August 2021. She has primarily provided behavior analytics services for students and teachers in public schools to support the development of efficacious treatment plans for students who engage in disruptive behavior in special education or general education classrooms. In addition to her clinical work, she also conducts research to identify effective instructional practices across a wide range of laboratory and classroom settings. And she served as a guest reviewer and guest associate editor for several peer-reviewed journals. In July 2021, she's going to begin a postdoctoral fellowship in clinical/translation research at the Marcus Autism Center at Emory University. And Stephanie Jones is also a board-certified behavior analyst with a PhD in psychology with an emphasis in behavior analysis, also from WVU. She's worked with individuals with severe and disruptive behavior in residential, recreational, clinical, and educational settings. Her research focuses on identifying efficient and effective interventions for problematic behavior that are realistic for caregivers to implement. She does this by focusing on researching effects of incorrect implementation on common reinforcement-based procedures, ways to improve the quality of staff training, and the extent to which behavior support plans are likely to facilitate successful behavior change. She has served as a guest reviewer and guest associate editor for several peer-reviewed journals. and she will begin service as an assistant professor in the Applied Behavior Analysis graduate program at Salve Regina University in September 2021. Now, it is time to roll on, and I am pleased to turn the floor over once again to Stephanie Jones and Catherine Williams.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I've put in the chat a few times, as has Nathan and Catherine, the stream text link, as well as information for how to join Pear Deck, which is our interactive software. If possible, and you can join Pear Deck by just opening another tab in your internet, or using it on a different device will also allow you to open Pear Deck. And it's important for you to do this if you're able to do so that we can interact with you, provide feedback based on the responses, as well as just figure out what's going well and what's not going well during the training. Additionally, we're going to be providing different areas for you to put your name and your email address. And for those of you who are looking for completion certificates or for the BACB CEUs, we're going to be looking at these to make sure that you are there for the entire training so that we can give you the appropriate number of CEUs. So please do join those if you're able to do so. Additionally, while I'm talking, and I'm Stephanie, Catherine will be monitoring the chat. And while Catherine's talking, Stephanie will be monitoring the chat. So just so you're aware, if you do have any questions that you want to do privately, please do private message the other presenter who is not currently presenting. Okay. Well, on that note, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Today, we're going to be doing some advanced discussion of functional behavior assessments. We're going to be covering kind of a broad range of things to do with functional behavior assessments, but all of it will be couched because this is a continuing education unit, assuming that you have some of the knowledge. But please do feel free to ask us questions in the chat or in the Pear Deck to make sure that you're caught up and that we're all on the same page. So first, this is going to be your first Pear Deck question. What's your name? This is where we're starting to gather that information for your completion certificates and for your possible CEUs. I'm going to give you guys a few seconds on this. As Nathan mentioned at the beginning, there will be other opportunities for you to fill this out as well. Okay, looks like I have most folks. Going to give you about another 10 seconds. Okay, and now if you could input your email address. Okay, great. Another 10 seconds on this question. Okay, lovely. And then we're just curious, and this is going to look a little bit different in your Pear Deck screen because this is a multiple choice question. But of the previous trainings that we've provided for your organization, which of these did you attend?
There it is. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another 10 seconds on this one. Lovely. So it looks like we have a fair amount of familiar faces and some folks who are joining us for the first time. So for those of you who are coming back, thank you for joining us again. And for those of you who are new, let us know if you have any questions about interacting with Pear Deck or anything else.
One quick thing about Pear Deck, I've received a couple questions about this, and I know it can be a little confusing. Once you enter your information, there's no submit button or done button. It'll automatically enter itself online, and you don't have to click anything else. As long as you can see it on your screen, we can see it as well.
Thanks, Catherine. And yes, so now a new Pear Deck question on the screen. What would you like to learn today? So we have this presentation prepared, but Catherine and I also like to do a little bit of on our toes work. So we are happy to make sure that we're including things that you request to the extent that we can. And we'd love to have an idea of how our training aligns with what you're hoping to learn. Yeah, so a lot of things that you are all talking about in here are going to be covered. And then some things that you have asked for will actually be covering on Wednesday. So we'll hope to see you all then. So for example, we have one that says how to write better support plans for adults. And just by talking about how to do an advanced functional behavior assessment, some of that will be covered because a good FBA is what forms the foundation of a good BSP. But additionally, I love to see that some of you are asking for scatter plot resources, which we will be providing today. An idea of some other types of FBA tools, because there's definitely not one standard way to do a functional behavior assessment. Absolutely not. I see some people just saying, let's see what you have. I'm open for learning, which is lovely. Okay, wonderful.
And I also see a lot, and this is Catherine, I also see a lot of people asking for just basic information on FBAs. And unfortunately, today we won't be going as much through the fundamental details of FBAs just because this is intended for CEUs. So we have to go a little bit above and beyond that. But I want to encourage you to, once it's made available online, go and rewatch the FBA instruction that we gave a couple weeks ago, and that will go over more of those nitty-gritty details of an FBA.
Thank you, Catherine. And that's a great prompt for this next piece of information. So because we are designing this to provide BACB continuing education units, I'm going to have to assume some baseline knowledge about certain things. Even those of us who have our BCBA credential, we're all trained incredibly differently. So I know that that's already really challenging. So please feel free to communicate with whoever's not, and this is Stephanie communicating again, whoever's not presenting in the chat when you have any questions at all. The CEUs are going to be provided through WVU. And once again, as Nathan mentioned, we'll be capping at 100 behavior analysts for those CEUs. We're going to provide you with the Qualtrics link at the end of the training for you to fill out. And again, that is 100 people, first come, first serve. Now, for those of you who are in this training and are not holding a BACB credential, that's okay. DBHDS can also provide you with a completion certificate at the end of the training. And we're happy that you're here. Okay, so now let's get into the content. First, I always like to start with a broad image. Why are we talking about what we're talking about? The goals of a functional behavior assessment, an FBA, are to inform effective individualized treatment. And why I think it's really important to center us on that before we get started is because I feel like sometimes when you start getting into the detective work and you're looking for your antecedents and your consequences and you're in the nitty gritty, it can be challenging to keep your eye on the prize at the end, which is that effective individualized treatment. So throughout this training, I challenge myself and I challenge all of you that even though we're talking about the work that leads up to the development of an effective individualized treatment, to always have that in the back of your mind. So now an idea of what we're going to talk about today. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about selecting and increasing the success of indirect assessments. If you came to our introduction FBA training, you'll know that we talked a little bit about don't stop at indirect assessment, do not do it. And also that indirect assessments are generally unreliable. I'm going to be digging in a little bit with more detail about what that actually means that they're unreliable and how to select one that's going to increase the reliability and the validity of your findings. And then Catherine and I are going to talk about selecting data collection systems for direct observation. That's where we'll get into those scatter plots that a few of you have mentioned wanting to learn more about throughout the trainings. And then last, we'll talk about problem solving FBA results. When you go through indirect and direct assessments, you often have a giant pile of data, right? That's what we want anyway, a nice big pile of data that might be hard to parse apart, especially if some of those data are contradictory. So we're going to dig in a little bit into reasons why your data may end up being contradictory and what you can do to problem solve those results. So first, how do you decide to conduct an FBA? What informs your decision that an FBA is the right move for a client? And this is a pair deck response. Thank you all for participating in the pair deck. It's so lovely to hear from all of you. A lot of us work in very different organizations. And I feel that a lot of that informs why we decide to conduct an FBA. So if you're asked to come in and conduct an FBA, that's a pretty good indicator for that. But I also see on here that if you have behavior that's already occurring that needs to be decreased for safety reasons, that's a good reason to start an FBA. Oh, I love this one, reduction of undesired behavior that is not due to a medical condition. So we already have that caveat right there, right? There's something more than just an undesired behavior is occurring. We also need to know that that undesired behavior is not due to a medical condition. You get a referral. Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes that's what happens. Not much more to do there. If you intend to formulate a treatment plan, absolutely. Okay, so a lot of these are pretty similar, which I love. A lot of us are on the same page for why we decide to start doing an FBA. But there are also some questions to ask before you start an FBA. Now, of course, these are within the limitations of your organization, right? So the rules of your organization or how your referral occurs are important in this. But these are going to align with the BACB ethics code, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So first, as somebody already said in the questions, has it been identified that the individual does not have an underlying medical condition that may cause the behavior? Before you start an FBA, this needs to be answered. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can't make the environment more therapeutic for the person while you're waiting for a medical advice. But the key is more therapeutic for the person. You cannot add anything that is restrictive in this situation. And oftentimes it's best to wait for the medical advice of a doctor before you do anything. So when I say more therapeutic, to be completely clear, what I mean is reduce any possible motivating operations in the environment. And then, is the behavior likely to cause immediate harm? So I'm sure all of us have been in a situation where we're called in and the behavior is extremely dangerous. And you need to find the function and you need to find it fast. But you also may need to mitigate, once again, some of those motivating operations to keep the client and to keep everyone there safe. And again, is the environment unsafe? So unfortunately, I'm sure many of us have also had the experience where we're called in to conduct an FBA, and then we might see some abusive practices. That's going to need a referral to a different body, right? Before we actually complete an FBA, we need to make sure that that abuse or whatever is unsafe about that environment stops before we move forward with an FBA. And then last, and this is maybe one that we don't think about as much, does the environment already include long states of deprivation from putative reinforcers? So what I mean by this is no one ever paying attention to this client? Does this client often go without breakfast, lunch, dinner? Those things that kind of go into that, is the environment unsafe? Is the behavior likely to cause immediate harm? But sometimes that might make your FBA much faster. If you go in and say, what are motivating operations that are in place for longer periods of time than you would consider appropriate for this client? So those are some nice questions to kind of get yourself going even before you start an FBA. Okay, now into the actual part one, what I promised you, which is selecting and increasing success of indirect assessments. So first, I want to hear from you all. How do you decide which checklist or rating scale to use for your indirect assessments? And if your answer is, I don't use checklists or rating scales, that's okay too. Oh, thank you all for filling out this prayer deck. There's so many great answers that I'm gonna spotlight, and I wish I had the time to spotlight all of them, or just, to actually have a conversation with you all. Okay, great. So I'm gonna show some responses. So first, this one, based on who the respondents are. Absolutely. So choosing your checklist based on your audience and the language that they're comfortable communicating in is a wonderful way to go. Additionally, the user's abilities and the frequency and duration of the behaviors. So we're not going to get too much into the nitty-gritty today for indirect assessments about how the checklists and rating scales are sometimes more beneficial depending on the frequency and duration of behavior or the function that you have a hypothesis that the behavior may have. So for example, there are some indirect assessments, checklist rating scales that are better able to identify an automatic function than others. And I'm not going to get too much into that. But there are some really great review papers that you can access to learn more about that. And then this last one, the one that the research shows to be the most or more reliable, or that more accurately predicts a function. And I'm really excited that someone put this in, because that's actually what I'm going to focus on now. I'm going to switch gears for a second and talk about how the research determines which of these checklist rating scales are most reliable and valid. So when we
Stephanie, real quick, this is
Yeah.
Catherine chiming in. Could you speak just very briefly? I know we went into more detail about this in our FBA training last week or 2 weeks ago, but about when you would use a checklist versus when you use it, because there's a fair number of people who respond that they don't really use one. And I think you may have something to say about when you should and shouldn't consider that.
Yeah, absolutely, Catherine. Thanks for asking. And this is Stephanie again. And for use of a checklist or a rating scale, there are considerations that you should have regarding maybe the resources that you have and the time that you have. So whenever I decide to use a checklist or a rating scale is when I have multiple stakeholders that are involved across many different environments. And I don't have the resources to do an open-ended interview with each of those individuals. What's really nice about a checklist and a rating scale is that it's easily quantifiable relative to an open-ended interview. What's also really nice, which I'm going to get to right now, unless Catherine doesn't think I fully answered that question. What's also really nice about a checklist and rating scale is that there's a lot more research on how reliable and valid these are. So really why that's important is because A, we have a better idea for these checklists and rating scales if we're getting at what we need to be getting at. And B, if we do have to disseminate our data to outside sources, it is helpful to say, I used a rating scale that has been validated by research. Here are the reliability and validity scores for the rating scale I selected. And I'm sure many of you kind of have something that popped in your head right there, like, oh yes, there are situations where I could use the data to suggest that my tools are validated. And this is what we're going to talk about today. So when we talk about, does the assessment measure what it was designed to measure, then we're talking about validity. And when we look into our research, there are two different types of validity that is often discussed. The first one is concurrent validity. And this is when our rating scales or checklists are compared to other types of functional behavior assessments. The most common is the experimental functional analysis, which many of you probably know is the gold standard for identifying behavioral function. So often when you're reading these papers, what they're going to say is, I conducted these checklists or rating scales, and then I compared it to experimental functional analysis, and the results were or were not similar. And that's our concurrent validity. But many of us in the audience are probably thinking, okay, great. It aligns with an experimental functional analysis. Does it predict an effective treatment, right? That's what our goal was at the beginning and what our goal was moving forward. And that's our other kind of validity, which is called predictive validity. So sometimes when you look in the research, it will also discuss, okay, we did these rating scales and then we implemented a treatment based off of it. And this is the percent which was effective for that. The next way that we can talk about whether or not these are, oh, I already spoiled that, sorry. The next way that we can talk about if these are good rating scales to use, have those data to present when we disseminate, is if I give the assessment multiple times, will the results be the same? And this is called reliability. And this is generally assessed in our literature by repeating the assessments over time, asking questions repeatedly or slightly differently. So framing of questions is important. I'm sure many of us have had to reframe questions to make sure that our stakeholders can understand what we're asking, or to just get a more precise explanation. And that's what this second point is getting at. And then also interviewing multiple staff and caregivers. So are these questions aligning across multiple raters? And these reliability and validity assessments and understanding the reliability and validity scores of your indirect assessments are really important for enhancing the believability of your findings. So again, and I don't know that I can say this enough, but I'll try. You shouldn't be stopping at a checklist or a rating scale. You should not be stopping at an indirect assessment. But when you're talking about the steps that you took to make sure that your assessment was the most reliable and the most valid and the most likely to result in an effective individualized treatment, making sure that these align are important. And again, maybe especially important when disseminating FBA results outside of a behavior analytic community. So all this being said, I'll be the first one to bear bad news. Current literature suggests that indirect assessments, specifically these ratings and checklists, generally receive reliability and validity scores below 80%. That's all the kind of unfortunate piece, especially because many of us consider 80% where we'd like things to fall. The good news, though, is that there are some that generally rate higher than others. And those are the two I'm now going to focus on when we talk about the checklist and rating scales. The first is the questions about behavioral function, or QABF, which was developed by Matson and Vollmer in 1995. The QABF is a really wonderful resource and already has at the bottom of it how you can rate respondents on your scale. The next one is the Functional Analysis Screening Tool, or the FAST, which was developed by Awada and colleagues in 2013. Now I'm going to get a little bit more into detail for each of these. So first, for the QABF, or the questions about behavioral function, there have been many studies with variable reliability scores. And unfortunately, this is kind of a trend when we look in the literature toward identifying which of these is going to be the most consistently effective. There are a lot of variable scores. And a lot of this, right, depends on how people measure it and the questions that they ask, which we're not going to have the time to get into today. But depending on the setting that you're going to be in, you should seek out one of the resources on QABF that looked at the setting and the implementer that you are going to be having complete these checklists. Part of what research suggests influences the reliability and validity scores for these checklists is who completes them and how they're trained. So that's another thing to cue in on. The highest predictive validity score. So recall that predictive validity refers to, we completed this checklist, we then implemented a treatment based on this checklist, and the treatment successfully reduced the target behavior, was 75% reported in the literature. The other good news about this QABF is that 75% comes from a high number of individuals. So this wasn't, it was a single subject design study, but it included multiple hundreds of people that resulted in this predictive validity score of 75%. Additionally, the treatment based on the QABF was 3 times more effective than standard treatment. So when they compare this to a treatment not based on the QABF, the treatment based on the QABF was 3 times more effective. So right there, we already have an idea, okay, don't stop at a checklist, but the QABF would be a good resource for starting your FBA and for getting those predictive validity scores that you can bring and show others. This is why I selected this checklist. So next, for our functional analysis screening tool. It has been found to be 72% reliable between pairs of coders. So what this means is when you are looking at this functional analysis screening tool, which again is a checklist, 2 people code it, and about 72% of the time they agree on the function. And then for the functional analysis screening tool, we actually only have, that I was able to find, so please let me know if I'm wrong. I'll put my email in the chat if I missed an article. But we actually only have the concurrent validity data, which means that they compared it to an experimental functional analysis, our EFA, and the FAST matched the outcomes of the EFA in about 64% of cases. The paper that evaluated this, which is like a pretty major caveat in my opinion, was done by Iwata and his colleagues, and they also conducted the EFAs. So the reason I add this as a caveat is because they conducted the functional analysis screening tool and the EFAs, and they are a very highly trained group. And that's not saying that you are not a very highly trained group, but because there are data to suggest the most that people are trained on a specific screening tool, the more likely that these are going to be valid and reliable outcomes. So again, to enhance the validity of your checklists, there are some things that you can do. I wish I had more that I could provide, but there are some things that you can do. First, you can ensure that the person delivering and analyzing the checklist is well trained. I know that we're talking about checklists right now, but also feel free to ask follow-up questions. Even if you don't have the resources for an open-ended interview, asking a few follow-up questions, if there's contradictory information in your checklist, is going to be helpful. And making sure that the person delivering and analyzing those checklists is well trained is going to help you do that. For example, I've given checklists before, and in a lot of these checklists, there are questions that say, do you think this behavior occurs because the individual wants to access attention? And then there'll be another question that says that in a different way, but within the same checklist. And if you get contradictory information across those 2 questions that are really geared to get at the same information, that's going to be a really good time to ask a follow-up question. And then last, predictive validity is higher when reliability between multiple raters is 80% or higher. So the reason I highlight this one is because predictive validity is harder to get at. That's our goal. We want it to have predictive validity. We want to know that our treatments are going to be effective. But unfortunately, that requires us to design and implement a treatment and have that in place for a period of time. Reliability is easier to get at because if you have multiple raters before you implement the treatment and you have that they are agreeing 80% or higher, then you have a better idea of predictive validity before you actually test a treatment that may or may not result in therapeutic outcomes. So something to think about there to start to test these different aspects of your checklist at indirect assessments. It's also going to be helpful when disseminating to say that you had multiple raters agree on the function more than 80% of the time. So things to think about as you go through these checklists.
This is Catherine. I'm just going to chime in real quick.
Yeah.
I wanted to add one more thing to your first bullet point here, which is that you might consider adding in a couple of questions or like asking follow-up questions on their answers on the checklist. But for a lot of the individuals that you're giving this checklist to, this might be the first time they've been asked these kinds of questions. They might not be used to thinking about behavior and the environment and that relation in this way. So one thing that I also like to do is just at the end, and this could be done by anybody, regardless of training, just like ask, like, now that you've seen these questions and it's got you thinking, like, do you have any questions for me about what I do, about what kind of treatment I'm coming up with? Or do you have any follow-up comments? Like, now that you've seen this whole list, has anything else popped into your head that you'd like me to jot down and add? And it's maybe more of a rapport building technique than it is actually getting more information from them. But I just find it's really nice to kind of personalize a checklist treatment in that way.
Thank you, Catherine. And this is Stephanie again. And now we're going to switch gears. We can only spend so much time talking about checklists, especially because some of you said, I don't use checklists. So now let's switch gears to what many of you said that you did use, which is the open-ended interview. So how do you decide which open-ended interview to complete? Are there the same considerations for how you select your checklist? Are there different considerations? I see a question in the chat about a specific QABF. I can add that resource to a folder that will be sent out, I think, by the organizations at the end of all of the trainings that will provide a little bit more information. And there is a PDF, if you look at the QABF, that's developed by Vollmer and Mattson in 95 that I really enjoy. Thank you all again for using these, the Pear Deck, and for giving me this information. So I'm seeing some comments in here about using the FAI, which I love the FAI. I'm a huge fan of the FAI, so the functional analysis interview. My number one downside about the FAI is how long it is, which I'm sure many of you can echo. What I will say though is I sometimes pick and choose depending on the setting and the situation, those questions, but I think they're such great thought-provoking questions that I often start with the FAI. I also see a comment on here, Hanley's open-ended interview, which I also really enjoy. It's kind of a shorter version of these open-ended interviews. And that's actually what we're going to talk about in a moment, Hanley's open-ended interview. Depending on who you're interviewing, absolutely, always going to have to be a consideration. But even sometimes if I'm interviewing someone where the language in the FAI is not appropriate, I still may steal some questions from the FAI and change the language around to be more appropriate to those who I'm interviewing. Saying the same considerations that you use for checklist, absolutely. Depends on the referral innovation. Great. Okay, lovely. Okay, so now to keep in kind of the same vein to talk about the reliability and validity, there are very few studies that evaluate reliability and validity specifically of open-ended interviews. So if you're thinking about disseminating and talking about how you selected your tools, you're going to have less to talk about for your open-ended interviews. There has been one study that I could find that looked at the open-ended functional assessment interview by Hanley in 2012. So some of you had said this in your chat, that this is the one that you preferred. And this article found that there is a 75% reliability score between multiple raters, and that there is a concurrent validity score of 50%. So concurrent validity, again, is that comparison to another FBA method. And in this paper, it was the experimental functional analysis. So major caveat here, we do not have the predictive validity score. So we don't know if this would have ended up being effective for individualized treatment, but it did not match the experimental functional analysis in 50% of cases. Other caveats for this study is that there was only 4 individuals who completed the EFA based on this. So essentially what I'm saying here is that the sample size is tiny. We had 4 people that they're talking about the reliability and concurrent validity scores, which also means that the reliability score means 3 out of 4, and the concurrent validity score means 2 out of 4, right? Which kind of changes the context relative to the previous studies that I talked about that had much larger sample sizes. So there's definitely some research that needs to be done in this area for how well these open-ended interviews do predict effective treatments. I saw some of you in the comment mention the practical functional analysis, and they're doing some work that is heavily basing some more structured EFA type tools based on interviews and having positive treatment results. So that might be an area of research to look more into. But what I will add here is not that I have done a comprehensive review, but I have not yet seen a comparison of just the interview and then a treatment relative to the interview, the PFA, and then a treatment. So there's still that gap in the literature that you should consider. So open-ended interviews are lovely and wonderful. And one of the reasons that I really love them is because you can use them to build rapport and to get a better idea of what's important to the client or the individual receiving services and the stakeholder. But they can also go really well or really badly. So let's take a second and think, what are strategies that you use to enhance the success of your open-ended interviews? And these can be anything, right? So how you talk to the person, how you decide when to conduct the interview, anything like that. Just interested in what you all have to say. And thank you all again for filling out this pear deck. I'm going to spotlight some of these answers. They're just too good to skip. Okay, great. Oh, I love how much I'm learning from your pear deck responses. Thank you so much for including these. Okay, so I'm going to show some responses just to talk about. So the first one, role play with a trusted colleague. Absolutely. I love the idea of practicing your interviewing skills before you start to get into a situation that's going to be more emotionally charged. And that's kind of the challenge when you get into these open-ended interviews, especially if you haven't met the individual before and you're getting called in for a behavior that is disruptive or extremely dangerous. Having this conversation with someone who that emotional charge is going to be out of it, you have that practice first, is going to be really helpful.
And I want to add too to that, this is Catherine chiming in, that a trusted colleague is also can be a colleague that you ask to give you a really hard time. And it can actually be, I find it really a great experience when you're with a friend and you're with a trusted colleague and you're in that situation. You say, I want you to be the worst case scenario ever. I want you to give me a really hard time. I want you to be really resistant to what I'm saying. And practicing handling those situations with an individual you trust before you're put in the high pressure situation and you're having to think about it in the moment when you may be a little more flustered or not able to like rewind and re-practice. Okay, how could I have done that better?
Absolutely. Thank you, Catherine. And this is Stephanie again. So this next point, phrasing questions in a way that makes the individual understand what is being requested and comfortable with the line of questioning. Absolutely. So sometimes just your framing of questions is really important. One of the things that I find most challenging when I'm supervising BCBAs is changing the framing to sound nothing like a blame. So sometimes when you're talking to a stakeholder who is the one who is working with the individual receiving services, just the way that you can frame your questions when someone's already defensive can be really challenging to building rapport during your interview and may even damage the likelihood that you get valuable information. So making sure that the stakeholder is rarely the agent of action in a question can sometimes be helpful when those questions do imply some causality to the behavior, which, right, we're looking for environmental variables that influence the likelihood the behavior occurs. So it makes sense that your questions will imply some causality. Just be careful to remove the blame from that. Also, your demeanor is super important, absolutely. Making sure that you're accepting and asking additional probing questions for clarification. Making sure that the person that you're talking to knows that their input is being valued. Absolutely. And sometimes letting the participant talk without interrupting. There's a balance to this. A lot of what I had to work on when I was starting out as a newly minted BCBA was actually reducing the amount that people talked without interrupting. I usually erred more on the side of being a listener and being an ear, where it turned more into I was there for venting and we weren't getting at what we needed to get at to make the change, which Catherine will talk about some strategies to balance that being an ear and making sure you're getting at what you need to get at to make the change. But absolutely. And additionally, sometimes when people are talking for a long period of time, you are learning a lot. Sometimes people's filter comes off a little bit more during that period of time, and you're able to say like, oh, okay. So it sounds like this period of time is really challenging for you because of these reasons that you may not have answered directly to your question. Absolutely. Building rapport before the interview. I love it. And this echoes this next question too. Don't rush into the interview. Try to ask some questions to have the individual open up. right? Small talk is maybe not everybody's cup of tea, but everybody has a thought about the weather, right? If it's raining that day, there you go. Something to talk about before you get started. And when you can't build rapport, which I know a lot of us are on really tight timelines, to the extent you can, absolutely try to build some rapport before your interview or during your interview, but providing education for why this is being done is wonderful. If no one has been interviewed for a functional behavior assessment before, it's going to be an alien experience. So letting them know what your education is, why you're trained to do this, and letting them know how this is going to help. I'm asking these questions so I can make the most effective treatment I can make for an individual. It's going to be wonderful. And then I love this last one, avoiding jargon. There are so many empirical articles in our literature right now that suggest that people don't like the way we talk. And to avoid jargon when you can is going to definitely help you build rapport. When I say definitely, it's because it's been shown in a few studies at this point. Okay, great. And now I'm going to hand it over to Catherine to talk to you a little bit more about how to increase the success of your open-ended interviews.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephanie. So this is Catherine, and I am going to be really going through the art of the interview. I think sometimes with behavior analysis, we often are imposed with this stereotype of we want data, we want facts. If I can observe the student or the individual, that's always better. But also during interviews, we kind of have to throw some of these hardline data collection ideas out the window. And we need to think about how can I create a supportive environment where the people I am talking to feel trusted, they feel respected, and they become, and I help build this relationship with them where we can now become mutual workers. And I'm going to use the term mutual and mutual respect a lot. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they have received the same degree you have, or that they have the same background information you have, or even that they are at the point where you're technically at the same staffing level. But it means that you are developing that trust relationship where when there are problems, they will come talk to you about them. And when you have concerns, you will come talk to them about those concerns. And both sides will receive those respectfully and as a discussion and as a movement toward productivity and how the system and the behavior plan can be changed to benefit everybody involved. And so really these opening interactions you have with these interviews are where these foundations for this trusting relationship had started. Yes, it's going to help inform your FBA. Yes, it's going to help inform your behavior plan, but it's also going to help set the standard for what your interactions are going to be like in the future. And so that's why we're spending so much time on these soft skills here. So I'm sure you guys have all had the experience of being interviewed for something before. And I want you to think back to these experiences and jot in some things that you may have felt went wrong when you've been interviewed. So moments when you felt off-putted, you felt like you weren't listened to, and kind of talk about how that felt and what that situation was. Because we are very often in situations where we're answering other people's questions, and we can learn a lot from how we respond to other people to then inform how we can set up our interview demeanor to not put people in situations that make them feel uncomfortable. Yeah, so I'm just gonna keep typing. I don't mean to cut you off at all. There's a couple of great responses already. One of these is moving too fast. Yeah, and Stephanie kind of got at this delicate balance, right? We want people to open up and we want them to be able to share with us and we want them to feel like they are listened to. And moving on too fast or even going to a really disjointed topic after they've spent a lot of time telling you about something can kind of make people feel like they aren't being listened to and they aren't getting that opportunity to share everything they want to. So one way that I've found to help with that balance of not moving too fast while at the same time not getting stuck in kind of a repetition of negative facts is by repeating what people are saying as the start of your response. So summarize, oh, I heard you tell me that one thing that can be really difficult for you is when this individual appears like they're not listening to what you're saying. And I really appreciate you telling me about that. And then you move on to what your next point is, and you kind of connect it. But what that short response and reiteration tells your interviewee is that you are listening and you value what they just told you. And it also gives you a check-in, because if they look at you like you have two heads when you say that statement, then you say, oh, I'm sorry, I might have misunderstood or misinterpreted what you just said. Can you go into a little bit more detail? And then you spend more time on that topic. So I think all that about 3 words, moving too fast, but absolutely, if you move too fast, you make people feel like they're not being listened to, and you may not get the information that you need. Not getting feedback on answers, and that kind of goes along with reiterating what people are saying. And we're going to talk a lot more about how you can give feedback on answers to sort of push the conversation forward toward the information that you need without making that person feel rushed or manipulated or like they haven't been listened to. Oh, here's a great point. Paying more attention to writing down responses than listening. I have such a hard time with this personally, because I always want to take really great notes. And I feel like notes can be very off-putting to people. If you're often looking down, now they're kind of feeling like they're in an interrogation room. They are being scrutinized for every single word they're saying. And so I address this in a couple ways, because honestly, I really need notes. I struggle to get a lot of good information if I can't take notes. So I usually start out that initial interview portion by addressing note-taking. I say, hey, like, I'm here today because I really want to understand you and your situation and understand the best way that we can work together to support the individual. So because of this, I really would like to take a couple notes on what you're saying, just because it's going to help me refer back to them later and be more active about the things that are important to you. And so I let them know that I would like to take notes. And then I ask them, I'm like, is it all right if I take notes? And if they say no, then that's okay. And I will work with it. And I've acknowledged the fact that I may forget some things that they say, but that they've been able to share with me the fact that it's important to them that I am 100% attending to what they're saying and not writing down. But if they say yes, then you've addressed the awkward fact that I'm going to be scribbling a lot and that I'm still valuing what they say. And I am not trying to use it as an interrogation, but rather as a way to build off of what they say more reliably. I also like to sometimes read people what I wrote as a way of acknowledging that I'm not trying to scribble facts about them in secret, but rather that I'm trying to accurately represent what they're saying. So I can write down like what I heard you just say, and what I wrote here is that it's really important to you that you're involved in your individual's learning. Is that right? Do you agree with that? Would you like to talk about that a little bit more? And then they're kind of part of your own note taking without feeling dismissed, or again, like you're keeping secrets from them in your notes. And I really like a lot of these thoughts, because what you're taking into account is how your interviewee is feeling and responding to what you're saying. Like, are they feeling misunderstood? Are they feeling like they're not being listened to? And a lot of how they respond will tell you how you need to change the way you're interviewing. And I think there's no one way to interview people. Rather, there's one way to pay attention to your interviewee to then change how you're interviewing over time. And so we'll talk a little bit more about those strategies. I know we spent a lot of time on this question, but I really appreciate you guys being so open about some of the experiences you've had. And I hope that you're able to kind of continue to ponder on your own interviews as a way to build your experiences. But now we'll talk about the good stuff. So think back to being interviewed. What are some interviews that you left feeling really positive, really empowered? And what aspects of that interview did you like? What made you feel that way? Because like many things, there's a million ways to do it wrong, but there's much fewer ways to do it right. Yeah, and some of these are very related to the negatives, right? Feeling listened to versus not feeling dismissed. And so we can think about how might we make an individual feel like they're being listened to, or how did that person make you feel like you were being listened to? They might have validated your concerns. They might have repeated what you said. They might have followed up with you. One thing I like to do in my notes as I kind of do the brief introduction of myself and getting to know, like the icebreaker at the start of the interview, is if somebody tells me anything about their personal life, or like what they did over the weekend, or I get a glimpse of like a hobby or anything like that, I jot that down in my notes. And then I like to follow up on that as a way to start future conversations, because it says like, hey, I'm not just here for information. I'm here also to get to know you as a person and check in on you a little bit as well. And then I'd also give you some insight into what kind of mood the individual you're interviewing might be. Like if you know they had some family difficulties over the weekend, they shared that with you, then you might change your tone during the interview a little bit more. You guys have some great points here. One of this is action taken based on your suggestions. And I'm just going to highlight this one real quick. I think that's an excellent point too, is that not everything about how the interview goes is done in the interview. It's also about how you follow up with what is said during that interview. And I think one way to make somebody feel really dismissed is to spend a long time interviewing them, really make them feel validated. You have a great interview session, and then you come in with a proposed plan of action that makes it sound like you didn't listen to anything that they said. So one important thing, of course, is to acknowledge how their statements during the interview have contributed to the plan, because that validates their contributions, and that might also make it more likely that they are going to buy into the implementation of that plan in the future. Body language, which is something we didn't mention so much when we were talking about the negative things, but I think when you see body language that works, you know it. And what does that look like? It looks like an individual making eye contact with you. It looks like they're smiling, they're nodding as you're talking, they're leaning in, they're not looking around too much or looking upset. And I think body language is one of those kind of low effort things that we can do just to increase the way that somebody feels, while also not needing to interrupt them to chime in with our own thoughts. Yeah, including some summary thoughts, following up on what you say, bringing up something that you said earlier and connecting with it. So a lot of just repetition, but not repetition with including some more of your information and context. Absolutely. So these are really great responses. And I encourage you again, as you start to take the time to think about this more and practice these strategies, continue to think about what it's like to be on the other side, because we've all been there. We've all had those interviews where we felt blamed and we left feeling upset or not listened to, versus we've had those experiences where we leave feeling empowered and enriched and like we're ready to take action and listen and work as a team. And I think we all want to aim toward that outcome, being ready to take the next steps. So now that we've talked a little bit about interviews and you hopefully have these thoughts swirling in your head, we're going to take a quick break for about 10 minutes. Go ahead and use the restroom, get some water, and we'll meet back here at about 10:12. And we'll talk about some strategies you can use as you interview to help have that lasting positive effect on your interviewee. I'll see you guys at 10:12. Hello, everybody. This is Catherine. I hope you all had a nice break. We're going to pick up where we left off. So recall that we just talked a little about some strategies that you've experienced that you feel like made you feel really welcome and empowered during interviews versus some not so great strategies that made you leave feeling an interview not awesome. And so there's one strategy that's pretty common in the behavior analytic research called motivational interviewing. And there's a couple of principles of motivational interviewing that I'm going to go over with you guys. But I think one thing you'll notice is that these align really, really well with all of the things that you've said that you've experienced that make you feel particular ways when you're interviewing. So you may hear me repeat some of these suggestions and these strategies, just because I want you to see how they align with this context and general approach. So the first part of motivational interviewing is called cultivating change talk. And what I mean when I say change talk is using language that promotes how things can be better and empowers an individual to recognize that they control their environment, they control the impact that they have on others, and that they are able to do things that support the people that are around them. And the other side of this is by softening sustained talk. So sustained talk is talk that's sort of opposite to that viewpoint of being empowered to make changes in your environment. Sustained talk is saying things like, I am stuck in this situation, or this always happens, and no matter what I do, I can't do anything about it. Where it's sort of this language that promotes this idea of helplessness. And it can be really easy to encounter people when you're interviewing who have this perspective, because odds are by the time you get in there, especially in a consultative environment, when you're in there to consult, they have probably already experienced a lot of negative effects, even if they have been trying all the things that they know to try and improve the situation. And so they may have this attitude that they can't do anything anymore. They've already done everything they can try. So what we want to try to do in an interview setting is soften that viewpoint. Another side of that is also promoting this feeling of partnership, because one way of accidentally promoting that sustained talk, that idea of sort of being helpless in that situation, is by making it sound like it's their fault and you're here to fix the mess that they've made, or that you're here to be in charge and that they need to do everything that you tell them, rather than that you're here to work with them. You're here to understand their situation, work with them to problem solve what changes can be made that are going to benefit them and the individuals that they work with. And by promoting this idea of partnership, you're also softening sustained talk by preventing them from feeling dismissed or feeling like they are being blamed. And we want to avoid those feelings because they're not being blamed. You're not there to pin the fault on anybody. Rather, you're there to help work with them and anybody in that situation on finding that solution and on making that solution sustainable. And if it's not a partnership, then it's not going to be a sustainable solution, because the second you leave, they're going to stop doing what you've told them to do, probably because they feel like they're being forced to do it rather than that it's something that you've worked on together. And another part of building that partnership is by being empathetic with somebody's situation. Now, there's a delicate line that Stephanie mentioned a little bit earlier about empathy, because we want to appreciate other people's situations and let them know that we are listening to them when they tell us that things are or are not going well. But we also don't want to turn into purely a vent session where we're hearing all of the negative stuff and none of the positive stuff. So one way that I like to help tip that balance toward being empathetic about successes, so sharing joy and success rather than sharing negative emotions about failures, is just by any time they bring up anything that's gone well or anything they've tried to improve their situation, talking about how awesome that is, how amazing it is that they're able to find the time and the strategy to do that in their setting, how creative it is, how much of a difference they are making on the lives of the individuals with whom they're working. And that also, in turn, to cycle all the way back to the beginning of this list, helps to promote that change talk, the idea that what they're doing, the effort that they're putting in is making a difference on the individuals around them, and also is making everybody that they're working with feel more supportive and less like they need to vent and more that they need to share successes with each other. So one way of cultivating change talk is by providing positive responses when interviewees provide comments that go against the status quo. So when they start to say things like, well, usually we do this and this, but I've noticed that that doesn't seem to be working, and I've always wanted to try this new idea. And then you encourage them through maybe repeating that idea and saying that that sounds great, as long as you agree that it's within the ethical standards and it is within the context of that situation, an appropriate thing to do, and empower them to then try that thing and see the changes that they make in the environment. So a lot of the situations that I have personally experienced when I'm doing motivational interviewing, I am being called in after the situation has spiraled out of control and has probably gotten dangerous. It has probably gotten to the point where the individual that I'm consulting with is very frustrated and feeling a bit out of control. So by motivating them to try something new, to make a change, even a little one, in their environment, and seeing that that has a positive impact, even if it's a very small one, like seeing an individual who doesn't usually smile laugh at a joke, or seeing an individual who never eats anything take a bite of food. Like those little wins early on make a huge difference, because they empower that individual, the person that you're consulting, to then realize that what they do matters and what they do impacts the individual they're working with. And then there's also asking follow-up questions toward change talk. And that means that you're sort of identifying the fact that you've listened and that what they've said is meaningful and that you want to hear more. And so, for example, if I'm talking to someone who mentions that anytime that they are able to kind of provide one-on-one attention with the individual they're working with, they really like that. And that individual seems to respond by showing more positive emotions, by smiling, by being more compliant when they're transitioning between places. That's really useful information for the plan I want to develop. And I want to hear more along that path, because it's stuff that is said in a way that makes it so I can immediately use it to inform a plan. And so I might say, that's really awesome. Have you ever considered adding in additional times, maybe like additional one-on-one attention before times that tend to be a little bit more troublesome? And then what that does is it allows them to talk about some of the things that they've done to problem solve, gives you some more information about the plan, but it also validates the fact that not only did you just listen to what they said, but you think what they did is awesome. That viewpoint, that perspective that they're sharing with you is really, really valuable, and that you want more of it. And then there's also a way of eliciting change talk with careful questions. So a lot of times you may find that when people are first describing a situation to you, they use terms that are what I call fuzzy. So these are terms when, like, oh, they're angry. Okay, that could mean a lot of things, right? That's a very fuzzy term. Or they are frustrated. That's not very specific to me. But what I can do is I can then flip that question back to them, recognizing that what they just said to me is an important piece of information. Oh, you just mentioned to me that you feel like they feel really frustrated. Well, what do they do that lets you know that you're frustrated, that they're frustrated? And then you can get more specific information that doesn't make them feel interrogated, like you're having to drill out all of these details, but acknowledges that they're contributing a lot of useful information to you, and then may also help them be able to give you this information in more specific language later on as well.
And this is Stephanie just hopping in real quick to elaborate on this previous point of eliciting. I often interview folks, and I think that when I was interviewed as well, I was one of these people who really focused on the negative. and would only bring up things that were negative. And even if I asked careful questions about, okay, so like tell me an instance with the individual is successful, they had a lot of challenges saying this. So sometimes thinking carefully about the questions you ask to elicit that positive speak that you can then try to cultivate. There's two that I really like. And the first one is, okay, if the president was coming to this individual's home, how would you prevent this individual from engaging in any challenging behavior? What would you do to make sure that they were on their absolute best behavior? And the second is describe this individual's perfect day, or describe the best day or best hour or best minute that you've ever spent with this individual. Because from there, you're starting to shift the tone to something more positive. And you're also getting a lot of information about maybe some possible preventative strategies that you can start to put in place when you develop a plan.
Yeah, thank you so much for throwing that in there, Stephanie, because you're right. Even with my example, I focused a lot on the negative. And it's really easy to fall into that path because people tend to have the most immediate responses to the negative. But by asking questions like that, I think you shift it all very positive. And you also always get a smile. Like when you ask somebody, what would their perfect day be? You can't help but smile while describing what you know is going to make that individual incredibly happy. So here's a question for you guys. What are some strategies that you have or could use to cultivate change talk now that we've talked about it a little bit? And you can be as specific or general here. I see some people are putting in specific questions, and that's great, but also just general strategies is awesome as well. Talk positively and look toward the future. I really like that one because you're right. It's not just being positive, because sometimes I think only being positive can almost make somebody feel dismissive if they're going into that very negatively. But if you're talking positively about how you can improve the situation and how there's things we can do and making them feel empowered to make those changes toward the future, then that's going to be really key to success as you start to ask them to do things to provide assessment information and test information. Yeah. And sorry, treatment information, not tests. Focus on what's working. Yeah, I like focus on what's working a lot because it does two things. It helps you find things that are working, obviously, but it also helps you validate how much effort the interviewee has already put into finding a solution before you got there. And it lets them kind of brag about that, all the things that they creatively came up with to try and do on their own. Yeah, what you like and admire about the individual. And I think that's awesome. And that will also sort of tell you what's going to be rewarding for the interviewee you're working with. If they really like when that individual is smiling and is participating in the group activities, then that tells you that that is something that might also be really satisfying for as an outcome of your plan for the people at that facility.
I also love how
Yeah.
many of you are talking about just how to start your interview. So setting the tone. And some of you are saying, what goals do you have? What do you want to see? What does this person like? And starting the interview in that tone is such a wonderful point. I also really like a lot of you are saying reinforcing staff attempts at problem solving. So, right, you're completing this FBA, the attempts probably didn't work, but at least there was behavior. And I love that comment of this staff tried to solve this problem, and we should thank them for that and let them know that we'll help them in that problem solving moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. Also asking for their goals, which is similar to that question that Stephanie mentioned, where it's like, what would a perfect day look like? But goals are a really great way to orient both yourself and the people you're working with on what you want the outcome to be. And I think it also is automatically going to be positive and provide them an opportunity to say what they want to see rather than what they don't want to see. Thank you guys all for responding here. These are really great thoughts. And I hope you continue to take such a positive perspective and enthusiasm as you continue with your interviewing. So the other side of this, we want to increase change talk and we want to soften sustain talk. And so there's a couple strategies we can use here. And in general, it's just a way of, I'm gonna be behavior analytic for a second, differentially reinforcing the way people are talking to us. And basically, we just don't want to spend as much time on the sustained talk as we do on the change talk. So one way, though, to soften sustained talk while not making the person you're interviewing feel like they're not being listened to is to sort of respond more neutrally, rather than if you respond to change talk very enthusiastically, or by following it up with another question, or by getting more excited. Here you can kind of decrease that response a little bit. You might also reflect the sustained talk, or attempt to pivot to sustain to a more of a change talk. So you might reiterate what they said and then start to rephrase it in a way that is more toward change. Or you might take that sustained talk and then say, okay, so you mentioned that right now this individual is doing all of these negative things and you feel like you can't do anything about it. And you would be more specific there, but I'm just giving a vague example. So imagine that you could have a perfect day with that individual. What would it look like? And you just pivot toward that question. You're still recognizing that what they said and that sounds difficult, but you're hopefully shifting their time and their talk toward more of that change talk. And then once they answer that question, you get little tidbits that you can use to seed additional change talk and sort of promote them to talk more about what they'd like to see rather than what they're currently seeing and how that may be a negative thing.
And these skills are, and this is Stephanie jumping in, these skills are what's really nice for making that balance that I mentioned earlier that I had challenges with, which was making sure that I didn't become just a source for venting, that we were still looking towards solutions to the problems. This softening sustained talk is really critical in that piece. But I also want to mention here that you're having these conversations that are going to be incredibly emotionally charged. These individuals who are the stakeholders in these situations, or the clients, the individuals receiving services themselves, are going to have a lot of negative feelings associated with some of the questions that you're asking. So although it's important to soften that sustained talk, I'm going to say in a second, Catherine's going to talk more about empathy. We're not going to ignore empathy. We're not going to say, make sure that your face is stone cold every time they say anything that's emotionally challenging. This is starting to talk to you a little bit about that now.
Absolutely. So now that we've mentioned a couple of strategies, I'd like to hear what are some things that you guys would do to soften sustained talk. I like this. It's really short and simple, but it's validate and reframe. And I think that if you could summarize the combination of what Stephanie and I have just been saying in much fewer words, that's it, right? You don't dismiss it, you validate it, but you then reframe it in a way that helps move toward a more change talk and a more of what can we do. And I also personally find that using that first person language of we and us throughout this interaction starts to build that idea that you are a team. You're working here, you are working together toward a shared goal, but also in reaction to some sustained talk that you have some shared experiences. And so some people have also mentioned here shared measured personal examples. And I think this, you have to be careful because this can easily turn a little bit into a vent fest. But I do think showing empathy by saying, oh yeah, that sounds really difficult. I remember this one time I had an individual who also seems like no matter what I did, they were just gonna keep trying to, whatever the situation may be, I'm just using this as an example, like terrorize other people. And that was really frustrating to me. But then I had this really great experience with someone who actually inspired me to then become a behavior analyst, who taught me that the way that I respond to those interactions can actually empower that individual to be successful. And so you can kind of take that as a shared point and then talk about how you've encountered your own successes in those situations. So it's a way of empathizing, but also pivoting toward how you can then change your environment. I think this is a great point too, is just lots of reinforcement. I think it's easy sometimes when we have conversations to throw the behavior analyst out the window. And sometimes it's a good thing, but it's important to remember that everything we do is functioning potentially as a reinforcer or as a punisher, even in conversations. And so what we really want to do in these conversations is reinforce the kind of talk that we want to hear a lot of, and that's the most useful for everybody involved, but also just to reinforce being open and being a partnership. And so one thing that I really like to do as well is just to reinforce when I come in that I value how much work the individual that I'm working with is doing on their end. And so reinforcing effort and reinforcing commitment, I think, is always a really great way to sort of work in some reinforcement, even when you might be hearing a lot of sustained talk, because that is what you want them to continue doing. You want them to continue believing that they have a way to change their environment to make it better for the individuals they work with, because they do, and you're there to help facilitate that. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about partnership, because I think it's really easy to go into a consultative situation and think of it being more of a hierarchy, and maybe even it is sometimes a hierarchy, but it can be difficult sometimes to work with people you don't know well if you're just coming in with the perspective of, I'm in charge and you don't know what you're talking about. Whereas if you're working on it as a partner, then you're going to be able to really work on developing stuff together and work on that build-in, work on that buy-in, work on that rapport, and work on building that relationship so that you can problem solve before problems hit rather than after. And so one way of helping to build this partnership is to discuss things together, such as the goals of the interview and being really open about that. And we talked about doing it at the start, like why am I interviewing with you? What information do I hope to gain and how do I hope to use it? And then also involving the interviewee with planning. And this may be limited depending on the resources that are available where you are consulting or where you're working. A lot of my experience has been in schools, and getting more than 5 or 10 minutes with a teacher that I'm working with is pretty near impossible because they're being pulled in every different direction. But even with just a little bit of time and like jumping in and out and throwing ideas and getting their immediate interactions can be a really nice way to continue to build that positive language, that change talk, while also helping incorporate the people who are going to be implementing the plan in the development of the plan and the treatment as well. And ask their opinions, or whenever you can, give them choices between different options, because they're going to know what they will and won't do and what will and won't work in that environment way better than you will especially after just an interview or two. There's always an overlying culture that we need to be sensitive to, but often are not going to be able to fully understand within the scope of the services we are able to provide. And so a cheap way of getting that insight is by building in opportunities to get those opinions from the people who are going to be implementing the plan within that culture and who are familiar with working there. And then also highlighting interviewee strengths rather than weaknesses. So finding things that they're doing well, which everybody we work with is an expert in something, and they know what they're doing, and it's finding those critical components that are really, really working well for them and enhancing those aspects and validating that effort that is going to help also build that change orientation. And then finally, center the interviewee as the expert. Again, they are the expert of their own environment. They are the expert of their own behavior. And more often than not, they're probably going to be the expert of the individual you're providing services for, at least more so than you, because they probably spent more time with that individual. And so the more that you can highlight their knowledge and their experience, the more that they're also going to be able to contribute in promoting a sustainable behavior change plan. So based on these sort of brainstorming ideas, what are some strategies that you have or have not used to foster this feeling of partnership? I'm sorry, that you have used or could use. Let me rephrase that a little bit better. It's okay if they're just coming to you now. You don't have to have done them before.
One of the things that I really appreciate about all the responses that you've put in Pear Deck thus far, even from the initial question about cultivating change talk, was that you are already including aspects of softening sustained talk, empathy, and partnership through all your responses. And what I really like about that is that it highlights that these are all tools that you can use in conjunction. It's not that first I'm going to cultivate change talk and then I'm going to soften sustained talk. It's a very fluid system where you're able to use all these tools at the same time to help you build a really positive interview, gather a lot of great information, and move forward looking at the future with hope, which I think one of you said in the comment, which I really liked.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, you guys have some great ideas. Using we language, or using work with, spend time with, what will we do, what can we do, I think is a great way. It's very subtle, but it just helps to reemphasize that idea that we are a team and we're working together. Also, I love this idea of check-ins. I think it's easy to look at the individual we're providing services for and think about all of the aspects of their environment that change their behavior, but not look at the person that you're interviewing or their interviewee or the people who are implementing services, and also remembering that they also have environmental changes that are going to affect their behavior and that are going to affect how they're able to implement services on a day-to-day basis. And having those check-ins helps you build that back and forth of like, oh, I hear you're having a difficult day today because your toddler was up all night last night and you came in today having not gotten a lot of rest. Why don't we not change anything today? Let's just talk about how we can observe what the individual you're working with is doing today and like see how things are going, and like not adding a bunch of steps for them that day, because that's going to be aversive if they haven't gotten a lot of sleep. So like also having that rapport, those check-ins, just to see how things are going is really, really great. Just scrolling through, you guys have so many ideas. Value their experience. Yeah, I like to always ask the people I work with questions about the plan or how they would do it or what they think is going to work best, or providing choices. This validates what they know, because honestly, they're going to know the second you leave, they're going to know what's going to work and what's not going to work. And that's really important information. Yeah, give opinions to people implementing the plan, checking in frequently. Yeah, just promoting that communication. And I think this is really important. Something that you guys, I think, are thinking about is this is not a single interview. We are not spending 1 hour with this interviewee and then never going to see them again, never going to talk to them again, and never going to get information from them again. Ideally, interviews happen frequently and they might be less structured, but having those check-ins where I can do like that 5 or 10 minutes of like, how are things going? What behavior are you seeing? What do you think is working well? What do you think isn't? It's a mini interview. My strategies are not changing at all, even if the span of time that I'm doing it, or maybe the structured nature of it is changing a little bit. You can do interviews all the time and you can continue to empower that change talk as you continue to do these interviews. This isn't a one and done situation. And in fact, I think in my experience, when you're in those stressful situations, when time is at a premium, which I think is in most of our cases, breaking up an interview can actually be really, really nice, because it gives people some time to sort of contemplate over how they've answered and what things they're seeing in the environment now that they've been asked these questions as well. All right, so I'm just going to talk about one more point here, and then we'll probably move on a bit more to Stephanie, but really just being empathetic is so important. Elaborating on the interviewee's points, putting yourself in the interviewee's shoes, and then also reflecting on what they're sharing with you emotionally is so nice and important. And it's going to help promote that relationship that you have with that individual. And reflect, I think, is really key here. Interviews are going to be different for each person that you interview because they're all going to have different experiences, different hopes, and kind of different motivations as well. And reflecting on how an interview went is going to help prepare you better for the next one. And just both improving your interview skills on a general level, no matter who you're interviewing, but also just to improve your skills with that interviewee that you're talking to. Like, okay, what can I go in next time and do a little bit differently? What did they respond really positively to? And what did they respond kind of like withdrawn about? Like, what should I avoid next time? And I always jot down some notes, usually as soon as I get out of normally whenever I get into my car, when I leave a situation that I just did an interview in, before I even drive away, I usually pull out my notes and I jot down just a couple of reflections over what I feel went really well and what I think I might use next time I'm there, sort of just to remind me while it's fresh in my head of what interactions are like in that environment. So based on that, what are some strategies that you could use to be empathetic to your interviewees? What are some things you might do? And I encourage you to reflect again back to those interviews that you've experienced. What are things that you felt went really, really well? And what are things that you felt made you feel like they weren't being very empathetic and you wish they had done differently? Yes, some of these are very profound. Validating concerns, but reinforcing strengths and positive moments. And I think that's a great summary here. Reinforcing strengths and positive moments. Absolutely. Yeah, continue to paraphrase and also rephrase, considering how that might be rephrased in terms of change talk if it wasn't change talk, if it was more of that sustained talk. Listening. Yeah. And listening sounds passive. It's one of those behaviors that maybe isn't a behavior, but you can be an active listener. You can make eye contact, you can nod, you can smile, you can do small gestures, little things like that, leaning in. Let somebody know that you're listening. And I find that to even be the case on Zoom. Hopefully most of us are able to move toward more of an in-person situation, but I do think that we're going to continue to see a lot of Zoom in our lives, for better or worse. And it's really hard to be an active listener on Zoom, but it's just as important, if not more important, to be an active listener on Zoom, because it kind of feels like you're talking to a wall sometimes, because really you are. Right now I am talking to a wall. So you can be an active listener on Zoom by smiling, by nodding. I'm really glad I have Stephanie's video on, because every once in a while I look over and she's not frowning. And so that's always a good sign that what I'm saying is okay. But also just being there for that person and letting them know that you, even though are not there in the room, you're there and you're listening and you're active, can be really, really helpful.
And this is Stephanie just chiming in quickly. There's a point that some of you have said is kind of a thread from the first time that we asked you a question about strategies to this time, which was avoid being scripted or robotic. And I think that we haven't talked a lot about this, and it might highlight how this is very complicated and a bit of an art. And if you think that this has been helpful for you thus far, please look into some more resources on motivational interviewing online. There's a lot of them. The clinical psychologists have been using motivational interviewing for way longer than any Catherine or I have probably been alive at this point. So please go forth and find those resources. And also, I know that sometimes it's nice to come in with a prescribed list of questions, but making sure that you're veering off of that, again, is really important. And I appreciate everyone's input on that.
Yeah, and I also want to add that one of the resources that's out there, and Stephanie will provide this in the folder that we'll send you out later with resources, but is also ways that you can provide feedback, so treatment integrity information on your motivational interviewing skills. So how often were you able to sustain or soften the appropriate statements and such like that. So especially if you're ever going to be in a situation where you might be teaching somebody else to use this, that can be a really helpful way to give feedback on motivational interviewing skills. So we're going to move on from here to talk a little bit more about data collection after we've done our interviews and after when we start to actually observe individuals in the settings. But real quick, while we're in the middle of today, I'd like you to go ahead and type in your name again, and then I'll ask for your email address after this. And this is just the sort of second check-in so we can make sure you're here and you're attending for those CEUs or also for those certificates. And if you're still having some difficulties with using Pear Deck, you can put it in the chat, but ideally put it in the Pear Deck if you're able. Give you another 10 seconds or so, and then I'll pull up the email address slide. All right. And then here we go. Here's the email address. Thank you all so much for responding. I know it can be a little difficult to type in your email address depending on what device you're using. Awesome. Okay. Nobody else is typing, so I'm going to go ahead. Oh, a couple more people are still answering. I'll give you another 5 seconds. I'm going to start talking a little bit about the next section we're going to go into. So we're moving towards selecting data collection systems to do descriptive data analysis. And there's a lot of ways that we can collect data, both in terms of what devices we use to do the data collection, and then also in terms of what data we collect. So I'm just going to give a quick review of some of our options here, and then Stephanie is going to go into more detail about some more advanced data collection methods that you might not be as familiar with. Okay. So just as a quick opening question, how do you collect data during descriptive observations? And here I'm looking more at format. So do you use a digital format? Do you use a cell phone, a clicker, a pen and paper? What strategies have you discovered are most effective in your practice for collecting these descriptive data?
And this is Stephanie hopping in. If you rarely collect descriptive data, if you often have other people collecting that for you and you create the plan, it's okay to hop in here and say like how you generally recommend, how you used to, like.
Yeah, so I'm getting a lot of pen and paper, which is classic. I love pen and paper, although I'll tell you one experience I had was the individual for whom I was collecting data, so for whom I was writing the plan, grabbed my pen and paper and then started reading my notes. And so that kind of at one point turned me a bit away from pen and paper and toward using a device that I was able to lock so that if an individual does grab their own data sheet, they weren't able to necessarily read it aloud. Yeah, pen and paper seems by far to be the most common. Also a timer, which I think is great. I always, even when I'm taking free notes on pen and paper, being able to mark the time is really nice because then you can get some rate data and you can get some idea of how much real time is passing between some of the events that you're observing. Data collection sheets are awesome if you know enough information to sort of get an idea for what behaviors you're going to be most interested in. ABC data collection is really common. And a lot of this seems to be sort of generally observational. So you're in a situation, you come in and you're writing down what you're seeing, which can be really useful because you're going to get a lot of information about the environment that you may not get otherwise, but also it can make analysis kind of tricky because it means that you're not necessarily organizing your data in a way that's going to allow you to have summary statements. So here's a couple of methods, some of which I think you'll be familiar with and some of which may be new resources for you to explore. One nice thing is using clickers to get some count data. And one application that you can actually, that's really nice with clickers is that you're able to just, click when they happen. You're not having to tally a score. You're not having to access that pen and paper. It can happen immediately. And also there's several applications for phones, and we'll go into more digital stuff too, that work as fancy clickers. So you click it just like you would click anything else, but it also gets a timestamp, which gives you a little more information on how often the behavior is happening in real time, not just the number of occurrences. And then
Yes.
there's several. Oh,
And sorry,
go for
just
it.
to hop in real quick, this is Stephanie again. I know that some folks may have individuals who receive services that have challenges being around tech. So sometimes you can't have your phone out, you can't have your computer or your iPad out without creating some problems. And there are some really subtle clickers where you can get the data where you're clicking, especially if the behavior is very high rate, that can get around that technology challenge that some of you may have with the individuals who you provide services for.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. That's a great point to throw in there. Computerized data collection, which I noticed many of you guys didn't use computerized data collection, and that's totally fine. You can do a lot with pen and paper, but sometimes computerized can be nice because you can do about as much touching and moving as you would do for a piece of paper, but get more information for free. And so some of the free ones that Stephanie and I use include County, which is an app for iPads and other devices and phones. There's also Android versions. And this allows you to create touchscreen buttons for different responses within the app, and you just touch it when it happens, and you can collect frequency or duration data on each of those responses. You can type in your little operational definition, which I find really useful, so you can see exactly what that behavior is and make sure that you're following that same operational definition when you click it. And it outputs a really nice report sheet that includes the frequency of the behavior. So how, like on average, how often is it happening over time or rate? And then it also makes it so that you can then save it on your computer in a very organized fashion, and it includes the timestamps, and you can do a lot of data analysis based on those data. And so this is sort of what it looks like. I know it's a little bit small, but here are 7 buttons for 7 different behaviors. You just start and stop. It tells you what time it is, and as you click it, it will collect those data for you. Now, another nice thing is you can also open a page and take notes on top of this, so you can still get some of the descriptive data that you like, the personal what's going on in this environment, if you don't have a button for it as well, and it saves those notes in the report.
Yes, and this is Stephanie hopping in real quick. For those of us who don't necessarily take the data, what's really nice about County is that you can send, for example, like this screenshot of what your data collection system looks like, and also include the definitions in there. And that might help you calibrate your data collectors across. So everyone has the same data collection system. Everyone is clicking buttons, right? So that the button kind of restricts what you can do. You may have had data sheets that you've given to people that you asked them to fill out in one way, but they did not fill out in that one way. And this computerized data collection may prevent some of those challenges.
Absolutely. And then another one we'll throw out there for your consideration is called Behavior Logger. And this works on computers. There's not an app version for mobile devices. But another similar thing that you can do here is you have different keys for different input data. So just like Stephanie mentioned, you can send a picture of what these keys are across people you work with and make sure they're all collecting data in the same way, which is going to allow you to collapse it and really interpret those data across individuals in a way that may be difficult if everybody's just taking pen and paper data, or especially if it's unstructured. And it also does frequency and duration data value, and it also includes an output report that's somewhat similar in that it gives you each instance when it occurred, and then also summary information such as rate or total duration or percentage of time within that observation. So quick question for you. What do you collect data on during descriptive assessments? So what behaviors or environmental situations might you include, and how do you sort of structure that when you're doing these?
There's some that you, and this is Stephanie, that you're all putting in that I'm just so excited seeing already, that are a little bit outside of the box of what a lot of people would think about taking data on during descriptive data assessments. So a lot of the times when we talk about descriptive assessments, and Catherine's going to go into more detail about this, we may really focus on, okay, antecedent behavior consequence. And that's a wonderful method to go about, but it's also can be more than that. And there's one person in here who's saying the time of day, the group size, the setting events, who are the staff that's present, what is the seating arrangement? And all of those things can start to add on and may be relevant environmental variables and may necessitate that your data collection system is a little bit more flexible than maybe you would have thought about. So I just wanted to highlight that real quick.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. Absolutely. And yeah, so a lot of you guys are kind of including ABC data collection. And one thing that ABC data collection is really great at is it is going to allow you to see things in the environment that occur before and after a response. But what ABC data may not always capture is what are other behaviors that are going on in that larger context, or what is happening in that situation when behavior doesn't happen, because that can tell you just as much as what is happening in that environment when behavior does happen. So we're going to go on a break because we're reaching around 11 o'clock, and then we'll reconvene at 11:10. And then we'll discuss a couple of data collection methods that you can use and different ways we can look at data beyond just ABC data. So I'll see you guys at 11:10.
Okay, everyone, I hope you enjoyed your break. I'm going to hop back into it. This is Stephanie. Okay, so when we talk about what to collect data on during descriptive assessments, a lot of you said we're going to take data on the antecedent behavior and consequence. And this is something that's like referred to in a more broad category called behavior trigger data collection, which means that you're starting to record the environmental events when the target behavior occurs. And this might be easier, especially if you're having other people take the data, it's going to be really hard for individuals to collect descriptive assessment data that's not triggered by the behavior, especially if they have no idea what to look for. And what's really nice about behavior trigger data collection is that it does allow for identification of environmental variables that precede and follow challenging behavior. So we're getting an idea here about the antecedents and consequences that are going to be relevant when we're moving toward development of a plan. And that's really nice. So by no means am I knocking behavior trigger data collection or ABC data collection, but the next couple things I'm going to talk about are just going to be how to broaden the types of data that you collect that may inform different parts of your plan in different ways. So the next type that I'm going to talk about is event trigger data collection. So this generally includes recording environmental events during an observation that are not necessarily just surrounding the target behavior. And you would also be recording appropriate behavior and challenging behavior. And what's really nice about this is you might have an idea of how relevant skill deficit is in the occurrence of the problem behavior, or how relevant the contingency is that there is a skill there, but it's not being reinforced for your alternative appropriate behavior. So in other words, to be more direct to what I'm talking about, you may have someone who you think their challenging behavior is motivated to access attention, but you can see, well, they always ask for attention. They have that skill in place, but the people are never responding to it. The staff are never responding to it. Rather, the individual is only receiving that attention contingent on the behavior. And that will inform moving forward in your plan, how much do I need to elaborate my teaching section? Or how much do I need to really focus on the reinforcement piece of my teaching section rather than the prompting piece, for example. Additionally, it informs environmental variables that could be shifted to insulate more challenging events. So for example, if you're frequently seeing during this event trigger data collection that this individual has challenges when demands are in place, when they have to go to community living classes, then something that you could think about is, okay, so that is a specifically challenging time. But what seems to help in other periods of time is when they have someone one-on-one with them. What might happen if I also add someone one-on-one with them going to these community living classes? Will that insulate the extent to which the motivating operation is evocative of challenging behavior? And then last but not least are these scatter plot analyses. And they would be under the category of the behavior. Well, they'd be under kind of the event and the behavior trigger. They're a little bit more complicated, but I'll get into that. But essentially, data are collected on the occurrence or non-occurrence of a particular behavior and are sorted by activities or time periods. And ideally, these data will be collected continuously, especially if people are living where the data collectors are. And what's really nice about scatter plot analyses, depending on how you use them, is that they could be fairly simple to train people to do. So you can make these on an Excel sheet. There's also some PDFs you can find online. None that I like enough that I'm going to provide you for a link for, but there are some resources online that you can access. But generally, I'll show you a picture of what these look like, but you can put something up on a wall that includes like 30-minute intervals. And you can say, just put a check mark in this box if the behavior occurred during this 30-minute interval. And the data collector can do this throughout the entire day. And you can have multiple data collectors do this depending on the area which your individual receiving services resides in. And then you can say, okay, now can I see the schedule for that day? And all these individuals end up actually collecting data on is when the behavior happened, which is generally pretty salient to data collectors. But they don't necessarily need to mess with the antecedents and consequences because you're also matching it to the schedule. Right? And there's a lot of ways you can combine and different considerations regarding your schedules, but just things to consider when you think about these scatter plots. So I always really like when I'm learning a new method of data collection or expanding my skills on one, going through an example. And I love scatter plots enough that I think I would like to walk us now through a published example of the use of scatter plots. So this example included a 14-year-old female with autism who lived in a residential facility. This paper, I think, was in the 80s or 90s, but I'll provide you with the citation at the end if you'd like it. So it's a little bit more of some of the residential facilities we don't really see anymore. And this individual engaged in physical aggression since she was 4 years old. And this caused her to be removed from her home where she lived with her family before shifting to a facility. So individuals had tried different interventions and had tried to understand the function of her behavior in different ways historically. And then some behavior analysts came in and decided to shift data collection to a scatter plot. And what they did was they taught Jones staff to collect data on whether or not the behavior occurred. And they had one box in the data collection sheet for each 30-minute interval during the day. And each time an episode of aggression occurred, the colored box for that 30-minute, and they colored a box for that 30-minute interval with either that more than one episode of aggression occurred or just one episode of aggression occurred. But I'll show you what that looks like in a second. Additionally, I want to highlight here that it was reported in the manuscript that throughout data collection, a timeout procedure was in place. So this is one of those pieces of scatter plots that is helpful. So we know the common consequence now. Every time this individual engaged in an episode of aggression, there was a timeout procedure that included her being removed from the environment. So for one thing here to highlight, that's a really intrusive procedure, especially before a formal FPA has been conducted. So one of the nice things that the authors highlighted in this manuscript is that the use of a scatter plot could reduce the need for these really intrusive procedures, right? Which is something that we all ethically need to be very heavily focused on doing. So now I'm going to show you what this scatter plot looks like, just the basic side of it. So this is for Joan, who is the client referred to in this paper. And the time of day in 30-minute intervals is going to be on the y-axis, and the day of the week is going to be on the x-axis. The black colored in circles are when multiple instances of episodes of aggressions occurred during that time period. And the open white squares are when one instance of an episode of aggression occurred during those time periods. So we have this scatter plot now. And this may look like scatter plots that you've seen before, and it may not look like scatter plots that you've seen before. But based on these data that you have in this graphic display alone, what conclusions could you make? And this is a pair deck response. So I'm just going to highlight some real quick based on data. I know that you are all still filling it out, but don't worry, we'll have an opportunity to look at that scatter plot more. So some of you had said majority of episodes occurred between 12:30 and 4 approximately. And that's what's really great with a scatter plot, is that you have that information. Okay, these are the time periods that are especially challenging for this individual. Additionally, we have when it happened the least frequently. So least frequently between 4 and 6. And this next period between 1 and 3 approximates the previous time, but also thought maybe it could be lunch or food. And what I really like highlighting about this response is what we get from this scatter plot is the periods of time. So now we have to shift and say, okay, what was happening during those periods of time? Was it lunch or food related, or were there other activities happening? So excuse me one second. Sorry, working from home. So as many of you had astutely mentioned when we were looking at the data, it looks like the periods of aggression most likely occurred from about 1 to 4 is what the authors of the manuscript suggested. Although I do think some of you said 12:30 to 4, 1 to 3, all have good rationale for that. Additionally, times when episodes of aggression occurred did share common traits. And times where aggression did not occur also shared common traits, which is a really helpful piece moving forward that the authors mentioned. And so what the authors said were episodes of aggression were very unlikely during the periods of time where there were recreational activities, group activities, one-on-one instruction, or meal times. So that was during that 4 to 6 period where one of the people said the behavior was really unlikely. So now we have some ideas of things where the behavior is unlikely that may be insulating and protective for that challenging behavior. So based on these pieces of information, what could be the function of Jones aggression? And I know that I didn't give you any antecedents and consequences, so you might be a little bit thrown back by how would I know the function if I don't know the antecedents and consequences? But from just gathering information about environmental events where the behavior is unlikely to happen, you do have information that could inform the function. Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of really great comments in here already that I'm going to highlight. So some that are really great. Someone just said escape, clean and simple. And the next comment, so because we know the common consequence is timeout, it could be escape, especially because when we're looking at the episodes of aggression that were, or episodes of aggression when they were unlikely, these may be the periods where demands are less likely. So meal times, less likely to have demands, recreational activities. One-on-one instruction, maybe not so much, but that might be a piece of the insulating factor. So thank you all for those responses. So now the authors also said, okay, during these periods of time when episodes of aggression were most likely, they were most likely during pre-vocational classes or community living classes. So this kind of provides a little bit more information about what might be especially challenging to Joan. So this next question, with this additional information, what could the function of Joan's aggression be? But also think here, what are some insulating factors? What have you learned from these scatter plot data? Yeah, I see a comment in the chat. Perhaps it's attention seeking because we're seeing that instruction during one-on-one environments isn't as problematic as during community classes, more group environments. I'm also seeing a lot of comments in here about escape. So we're seeing that these challenging behaviors are primarily occurring in those larger classes with some of the other people who lived in her facility. And this is definitely a piece that may lean toward escape, but also may suggest that attention is an insulating factor. So having a one-on-one staff with her may have been helpful in these contexts. I also love that a lot of you are still thinking there's probably still some setting events that we don't have data on in these scatter plots. And that's absolutely the case. These scatter plots are not necessarily designed to get an idea about setting events because we're just taking data on the occurrence or non-occurrence of behavior during different times of day and not necessarily on, okay, well, did they actually eat their lunch when we're talking about these things. So now I want to just show you how powerful an intervention can be based on a scatter plot. So over here, we have the initial evaluation data. And as a reminder for everyone, Joan's behavior was so severe that she was removed from her home and was living in a facility since she was 4 to 14, and that they had tried multiple different interventions with no success. So then the researchers came in and they said, okay, here are the common blocks of time. And like many of you, they said, we think that escape is the function and that attention may make the motivating operation to escape from an activity less aversive. So what they did was they did something that we call demand fading more nowadays, but they didn't necessarily call it that time. And they pulled Joan, and I know that this is challenging, but they pulled Joan out of all those activities that Joan had challenges with and substituted them for activities that she had during other periods of the day where she was unlikely to engage in those episodes of aggression. They then slowly added those aversive activities back into her day with more support. By the time that they did this 12-month follow-up, she was embedded back in all of these activities that were historically very challenging for her without that additional support and without aggression. So having an idea of how these scatter plots could work and seeing that long-term goal at the end of a successful treatment, I hope really motivates you all to consider scatter plots in the future. Okay. So now to shift gears a little bit, and I know that we've been doing a lot of shifting, but having conversations about FBA resources and how to make these as effective as possible. There's so many things to cover that we just couldn't resist going through kind of the part 1, part 2, and part 3 as we see it. So when we talk about problem solving FBA results, the first thing I always think of is I probably have so much data, which is a good thing to think about, right? So hopefully you started with a record review, which we haven't even really had the time to talk about, unfortunately. But you have your data from the record review, and then you hopefully have data from checklists from multiple parties if you decided that that was the right route for you. And again, if you want to hear more about considerations about when to select using or not using checklists, our training that we did on the introductory FBA will be made available through the organization after all the trainings are completed. And some gap of time there, some people need to review them first, of course. Additionally, open-ended interviews, which are just challenging in themselves to analyze. And then you also have your descriptive observation, which may include antecedents, consequences, the frequency of the behavior, the events where the behavior is likely and unlikely to occur. And when you put all these things together, sometimes you may have a portrait, a beautiful image where you have a great idea of what the function of the behavior is and you're ready to move forward. And sometimes you might feel like you have a bit of a jumbled mess. All your checklists say that the function is different. Your descriptive observation doesn't match your checklist. The previous FBA at a different organization does not match the results of your FBA. All of these things are possible. So what are some reasons that you have maybe experienced or that you've heard of that your FBA results could be unclear? If you end up in the camp where you have a jumbled mess of data in front of you, what are some reasons that this may be the case? I love so many of these answers. So the first one that popped up was that the time span between each of your methods of understanding function was too long. So if the record review includes data from when the individual is 4 years old, and now the individual is 30, your record review may not be the most informative piece of your FBA. There's of course going to be valuable information in there, but it may not be the most important piece. Additionally, if you did your indirect checklist assessments or open-ended interviews 6 months before you were able to get down for direct observation, that's going to be really challenging. A lot of things may have changed in that period of time. So great point. Also, if you're very heavily relied on indirect assessment, it may make sense that your FBA results are really challenging to interpret. Indirect assessment, as we covered when we went through our reliability and validity measures, is not the best way to ascertain behavioral function. Unfortunately, even when we have some really amazing people trying to work on these open-ended and checklist interviews and checklists, they still end up being generally less than 80% reliable and valid. I only showed you today the ones that we had the highest scores for the checklists. So a lot of the checklists that you run into are actually going to have significantly lower validity and reliability scores. Also, for your open-ended interviews, there's very little research on whether they're valid or reliable. So that's another piece. Another great one, training wasn't done. If your data collectors weren't trained, which I understand sometimes you're at a pinch for time, but if your data collectors weren't trained, that may end up causing you more time in the back end. because your data are not reliable. Additionally, maybe your definition is not clear. You may have not been able to capture setting events, or you may have multiple functions. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes you do have multiple functions to your behavior. Although our literature suggests it's less common than having a single function, it is very possible that that's the case. Additionally, it kind of interacts. How well you've written your operational definition / how broad your operational definition is interacts with whether or not you end up having a multiple controlled behavior. So if you have large umbrellas where you're fitting your challenging behavior. So if you say, I want you to collect data on aggression, which includes kicking, hitting, spitting, property destruction, which includes tearing up paper and throwing chairs, and cursing, all under the one lump of challenging behavior. You may see, okay, I have multiple functions here, but it's possible that these topographies have different functions, but they look like a multiple function when they're collapsed. So great points. Conflicting information from different sources. Behaviors are inconsistent across individuals or settings, absolutely. And as we know, that may be okay, right? So behavior may be context dependent. So if we're getting that different interviewees say different things, it may be that the individual receiving services behaves differently with each individual who we're talking to. And although that makes it challenging, there may be some more detective work we can do to figure out, okay, why is Greg so well behaved when Gloria is his aide versus when Sam is his aide? And start to dig into that a little bit more and figure out the details of what influences the behavior. Additionally, if you have contradictory or unclear data, behavior may be really heavily influenced by a setting event or a motivating operation. And those are often challenging to get at during your direct observation, especially depending on the windows that you have direct observation for. So you may want to consider really digging into, okay, what are some common setting events? And how can I make sure that those are taken care of for this individual and that they're not in place? And as I mentioned kind of on the previous slide, you may be working with a behavioral definition that's too broad. So sometimes you may not have the resources to figure out the function for each target behavior. And that's kind of a can of worms where, okay, you can say the challenging behavior is multiply controlled. But sometimes it may be really beneficial to hammer in specifically, okay, so we have severe aggression, and we need to focus all of our efforts on reducing that aggression before we can move on to some of these other topographies of challenging behavior, such as cursing or property destruction. And if your behavioral definition is too broad, you may end up with a treatment that is too much for what could work for aggression. So if you have just aggression maintained by access to attention, but you end up putting in a treatment for escape, attention, and tangible, some of those factors may be contraindicated. So what you do after an escape maintained behavior is going to be different than what you do after an attention maintained behavior. And second, you may have a 12-step plan when you really only needed to have a 5-step plan. And when you think about how that may affect implementation, it's really important to think about when you're starting your data collection, how to write your behavioral definition to make sure that you've catered directly to the most important behavior that you need to tackle immediately, unless that's not your goal, right? It all depends on your goal. So now let's go through some anecdotes and actually problem solve what may and may not be a challenge. So the first anecdote, Gloria's one-on-one aide suggested that behavior rarely occurred in the morning. And her alternate aide said that behavior exclusively occurred in the morning. So what are some possible reasons for this discrepancy? Yes, you're providing so many great thoughts. Are they doing different things with her? What other times do those aides work with her? And are the responses different? I think someone said in the chat, Gloria doesn't like her alternate aide, right? So is it really that she doesn't like her alternate aide, which we could get into unpacking a little bit more why that would happen? Or is it specifically something that the alternate aide does in the morning, right? Where is this source coming from? Additionally, is it your behavioral definition? Is Gloria's one-on-one aide saying that the behavior never occurs in the morning because she thinks you're talking about cursing, but her alternate aide thinks you're talking about hitting? So that's a really great point of why this might be different. Also, the one-on-one aide may just have a really different perspective or attitude when talking about the behavior. So you may need to be really careful when you pick your specific questions to say, I really love how positive you are. Does she do anything that's challenging in the morning, right? Kind of shifting gears and saying like, there's nothing going on in the morning, to have a better idea of why those things are different. So you guys have a lot of great thoughts of why this may be different. So what's your next step? How do you start to identify the cause of this discrepancy? And this kind of question might highlight that your FBA is more of a fluid process than maybe some of us would like, right? Sometimes we'd like to do our FBA and tie a bow on it. But when we get this contradictory information, especially when you've done a lot of different methods, it's important to go back and identify these causes of discrepancy, because at the end of the day, it's going to save you time when you get to intervention. So if you make an intervention based on Gloria just doesn't like her alternate aide, when really it's something that Gloria's one-on-one aide is doing that is preventative relative to Gloria's alternate aide, your treatments are going to be so different, and one of them may not work. Yeah, so I love so many of your points. Observe each of them separately. So what is the alternate and the one-on-one aide doing differently? And I also like this comment, remotely if possible, to reduce reactivity. I know that's really challenging for a lot of us, but I really want to highlight that I like the comment on reactivity here, because sometimes your reports may not match your observations because of reactivity. So if while you're in the room, Gloria's alternate aide is Mary Poppins, and while you're not in the room, she is no longer Mary Poppins, that's going to be really hard for you to figure out. So there's some ways to work with reactivity that have been identified in our literature, but just a few to mention really quickly. Observing for longer periods of time. So, and I know that's hard with a lot of the resources that we have, but when you start to blend in and be kind of a fly on the wall, that will reduce reactivity over time. Also, building the rapport and saying, you know, I really just need to see how things are generally is going to be helpful for you in that situation. I also see some comment in here, the aides must document specific steps that they do to give support. And that might be a way around if you cannot observe, but also just to remind you here that people are generally not super skilled at labeling their own behavior. And that's behavior analysts included. It is challenging to talk about your own behavior. Observation, record, watch later, troubleshoot. Great point. Getting the aides together to sit down and talk about what the mornings look like and being there for that conversation. And isn't that such a great way to build partnership too? We're all a team. We all want Gloria to be successful. So let's sit down and talk about what goes well and what does not go well. Okay, thank you all for all of your input. So wonderful. So now the next one we're going to troubleshoot. Although you've observed Harriet for multiple hours, you have not seen any challenging behavior. Although your indirect assessment suggests that challenging behavior never seems to stop. What are some possible reasons for this discrepancy? Yeah, so a lot of you are saying reactivity here. Absolutely. So that reactivity could be the individual who's receiving services. So they may end up being on their best behavior, right, when you're in the room observing, or it also could be the staff. So the staff's behavior is changing relative to how it normally would be because you're in the room. Yes, all great points. Staff training, another really good point. And all roads lead back to your operational definition, right? So are you looking at something different than what was being discussed in your indirect assessment? Great points. So how can you start to identify the cause of this discrepancy? Some really great points. So some of you had said remote or video observations. And if that's possible, that is very possible to decrease some of that reactivity, as long as you don't have folks who are specifically reactive to cameras, which I'm sure many of us have run into some of those folks before. Role playing. Sure, absolutely. Do another interview. Circle back to some of those earlier pieces. Make sure that your operational definition is the same. Observe over a longer period of time. Yeah, so becoming that fly on the wall. The other piece that some of you are saying is ask. So once your observation is over, you could say, is that normally how that goes? What about that was the same or different relative to how that activity normally goes? And what they may say is, well, you know, they had a really good night of sleep last night, so I'm not surprised that they behaved really well. And then boom, we know that we have a motivating operation that is in play that we're not necessarily going to be able to observe. So asking those questions continuously, even throughout your direct observations, is going to be helpful for you for identifying the causes of this discrepancy. Oh, absolutely. Okay, so you find that Kirk's challenging behavior is maintained by escape from tasks, social avoidance, attention, and access to tangibles. Why might you have found this? Yeah, so many of your responses are challenging behavior is probably too broad. You may want to figure out specifically which topographies of behavior are reinforced by which of these reinforcers. Also, there may be different contexts for each function, absolutely. So the same behavior may work to escape from tasks, to avoid social interaction, to gain attention, and to access tangibles in specific contexts, yes. This also might be a piece of information if your individual that you're working with has very little skills. So if challenging behavior is really the only way that they're able to access their needs, then it's possible that you may have a challenging behavior that's reinforced by many different things in different contexts. And what you may need to focus on there is shifting to your skill building phase. Great points. So if this is what you find, what's your next step? So you find that Kirk's behavior is maintained by escape, social avoidance, attention, and tangibles. What do you do next? Yeah, so I love a lot of your points. So redefine your behavior. Go back and maybe retrain on data collection. Are we all observing the same thing? Another comment that I really like is break it down and start to work on the most impacting behaviors. So if you come back with an FBA that's really inconclusive, especially one that says that the behavior functions for attention and social avoidance, right? Those are really challenging to address with the same intervention. Then going back and saying, okay, I need to make sure my data collectors are on the same page is a really good way to go. Another really great comment, take it one environment at a time. So instead of maybe lumping your direct observations across environments, you may want to just say, okay, so specifically when this individual is at lunch, this is what behavior in the environment looks like. Specifically when this individual is going through their care routine in the morning, this is what behavior in the environment looks like. Really great points. Some of you are saying you may need to go to a more in-depth analytic tool. And if that's within your area of expertise that you're able to conduct a functional analysis, that may be the right next step for you. But that totally depends if that is within your area of expertise and a safe thing to do. Match intervention to the context. Absolutely. So if when you see this really broad list of behavioral functions, and you see, okay, wait, there are patterns within context, or there are patterns within implementers, times of day, anything like that, then that might be the end of your FBA. You might say, like, no, this is it. We have multiple functions. We just need to cater our intervention specifically to these contexts. Great points. I so appreciate everyone joining me in the care deck as well. I know I've said this in some earlier trainings, but it really helps, as Catherine mentioned, kind of reduce the Zoom feeling of that you're not really talking to anybody. To hear back from you guys really helps me know that we're kind of on the same page. Okay, and now this is going to be our last one to problem solve, because I know that we are running low on time. So Enya's direct care staff unanimously agreed that the behavior only occurs when she's receiving staff attention, or when she is not receiving staff attention. Your observations, though, suggest that the behavior occurs primarily following demands from staff. So what are some possible reasons for this discrepancy? Yeah, so many of you are just saying, I need more information before I can do a lot about this. And with a lot of these problem solving pieces, absolutely, you're going to end up needing a lot more information. And unfortunately, we just don't have the time within these trainings to get into more detail for each of these specific examples and do some more problem solving together. But one thing that I like on here that's being said is maybe the demand is given and then the staff walks away. Everyone could be right in that context, right? And then when the individual engages in the challenging behavior, the staff come back. So demands could be a signal to the individual, attention is not available coming up in this context. Really great points. I also love the comment of it's the way the staff interact with Enya. So it may be something a little bit more qualitative about the antecedent. So although the demand may look like attention, Enya does not like demands, but she really likes soothing attention. Something different like that, more conversational attention. Great points. And then I love this comment of indirect assessments are generally unreliable. Yeah, so people aren't great at labeling environmental events without really specific training. So what you're getting here is that, okay, if I'm comparing my indirect assessments and my observations, I should definitely consider all of this in my development of a plan, but it might be okay that my indirect assessments don't directly match my direct observations, because there's a lot of literature to suggest that they don't necessarily do that. So it's all about gathering as much information as you can to see what is supportive of a hypothesis, what isn't supportive of a hypothesis. Do I need to make plans across a bunch of different contexts? And we could talk about this all day, but we don't quite have the time for it. So I really appreciate you guys putting all this information in here. And I kind of want to end with the thought of your FBA is inconclusive. You have a bunch of data you don't know how to weed through. Is there someone on the team that you can sit through and talk through it? Is there resources that you can pull to have a better understanding of why this might be that way. And if you don't have another behavior analyst in your organization or someone who's really savvy with FBAs, is there a way that you can de-identify this enough to talk to a trusted colleague and say, these are the general problems I'm having, right? So saying something like, my indirect assessment suggests an attention function and my direct observation suggests an escape function. Have you ever run into this before? And pulling on your resources in that way may be really beneficial, as long as you do so in an ethical way, which is really the key. So we hit 11:50, which is our time to stop. And I want to thank you all very much for taking the time to input these responses and to be with us today. I'm going to pop up the Pear Deck responses for getting your name and information, and I'll keep putting these through. I know Nathan has some closing statements that he'd like to talk about as well.
Hey, everybody. Just want to thank Stephanie and Catherine again for an excellent training, really informative, very engaging. Thank you so much. I want to note to everybody as well that there is one more training session that we still have slots for. So if you are interested in that, you can go in and register in Eventbrite, and we will close the link down probably about this time tomorrow, probably midday on Tuesday. So if you're going to be registering for that event, also please keep in mind to double check your email address when you register. Just make sure that you've got it spelled correctly. Otherwise, I won't be able to get you the meeting link. And I just want to thank everybody for their attention and participation today. Stephanie or Catherine, is there anything else that you'd like to add or information that you were going to give on the Qualtrics survey?
Just definitely echoing what Nathan mentioned. Thank you all so much for your attention, your participation. The Pear Deck is up right now for everyone to input their name so that we can provide you with those completion certificates as well as the CEUs. If the Pear Deck is not working for you, although we'd love if you are able to use the Pear Deck, feel free to put your name in the chat. I'm going to be providing the Qualtrics information in just a moment. And I'm also about to circle from what's your name in 10 seconds to your email address. Catherine, do you have anything to add?
No, just to make sure to stay on until we share the Qualtrics link so you can get your CEUs. And I have a couple people asking for resources such as the slides and the videos from this. And those will need to be reviewed for probably a couple weeks after the trainings are done, and then they will be made available. Watch out for more information about that from Nathan.
Okay, great. Thank you all for putting your information into the Pear Deck. I'm going to give you all about 10 more seconds on the email address. Okay, great. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to ask for your feedback really quickly. And I know that you are all waiting for this Qualtrics survey, and I promise I will provide it. But we do have one more training on Wednesday that we will be presenting on advanced behavior support plan development for continuing education units again. And we really want to make sure that we are able to provide similar experience for that you did like. And then the next slide that I'm going to ask you to provide about what you did not like, so that we can better cater our BSP training to that. Okay, great. Thank you all so much for your thoughts here. And because I know that I'm keeping you over your time, I'm going to go ahead and ask you what you didn't like. Thank you all so much. And then I'll have one more question and I'll put up a link for CEUs. And I so appreciate all of your feedback. Okay, great. Thank you all so much. It looks like I don't have anybody else typing. So last but not least, what would you like to learn for your advanced BSP training? So as you may expect, since the training is on Wednesday, most of the content is already produced. But if there is anything specific that maybe we could elaborate on or add some examples that would help you, please do feel free to put in anything that you've had an itch to learn. And again, thank you all for your responses. I'll give you about 10 more seconds on here, and then I'll give you the link. Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and pop the link in the chat for this Qualtrics survey. Give you guys another minute if you're still filling out what you'd like to learn about BSPs. No one is typing. Okay, great. And now here's the big link on the slide.
And the first question of that survey asks if you're a board certified behavior analyst. Please answer yes to that question, even if you're a BCABA or a BCBAD. That's just to ensure that you are eligible to receive the BCBA continuing education units.
Thanks. Yeah, so you won't be able to get the link from the PowerPoint slide, but I put it up there in case you wanted to just write it down and use it later or take a picture of it or anything like that. But I've also put the link in the chat. So if you'd like to copy and paste the link from the chat, that should work for you.
And once you're done with that, and if you don't have any more questions, you're welcome to go ahead and leave. We'll hang around for a couple minutes to answer any lingering questions that you may have.
Okay, I think the questions in the chat are dying down. Do you guys want to hop into another room? Okay.